They stabbed
You
a
knew the
homeless man and
rules.
walked away.
Please, he's my
No
brother.
arrest,
It was
no
my fault, not
consequences.
hers. No
Just
exception.
another evening for 5 rich kids who had been untouchable for 3 years. The teachers knew. The principal covered it up. The system bent around them like water flowing past stones it could never move. But there was one thing nobody counted on. That homeless man had just saved the daughter of Toledo's most feared Hells Angels leader. And that daughter was not the kind of girl who waited for someone else to fight her battles. 24 hours later, the roar of 250 motorcycles shook every window in that school. The Brotherhood had arrived, and they weren't leaving until justice was served. But here's what will shock you. It wasn't the bikers who brought that school to its knees. It was an 18-year-old girl with a folder full of evidence and a spine made of iron. Before we get there, let me tell you about a man the world forgot. His name was Garrett Slade. He was 23 years old, barefoot, homeless. For 3 months, he'd been sleeping behind the dumpster near Ridgemont High School in Toledo, Ohio, curled on a flattened piece of cardboard that barely kept the cold concrete from leaching the warmth out of his bones. Night after night, he lay there beneath the open sky, exposed to rain, wind, and the steady indifference of a world that had long stopped noticing he was part of it. Garrett owned almost nothing. He wore the same clothes every single day, a faded green sleeveless shirt with a small tear near the hem, red cargo shorts stained with dirt and grease and time, no shoes, no jacket, no bag. His dark brown hair hung past his eyes, uncut and uneven, tangled from weeks without a comb. Stubble shadowed his jaw, rough and neglected. His hands were cracked and calloused, the knuckles swollen, the fingertips permanently stained with grime. They were the hands of someone who had once built things, fixed things, made things work. Hands that told a story nobody had ever bothered to hear. 3 months earlier, Garrett Slade had been a different man. Not wealthy, not powerful, but steady. He had worked as a mechanic at a small auto repair shop on the south side of Toledo, a place called Bridger's Garage, that had been owned and run by the only person who had ever treated Garrett like family. His name was Earl Bridger. Earl had taken Garrett in when Garrett was 16, a foster kid bouncing between placements, angry at the world, and heading nowhere good. Earl didn't lecture him, didn't preach. He just handed the boy a wrench one afternoon and said, "If you can learn to fix what's broken, you'll never be useless." That was it. No grand speech, no ceremony, just a quiet old man giving a lost kid a reason to show up in the morning. Garrett showed up every morning for 7 years. He learned engines the way some people learn music, by feel, by instinct, by listening to what the machine was trying to tell him. Earl said Garrett had the best hands he'd ever seen, gentle when they needed to be, strong when it counted. By 22, Garrett was running most of the shop himself. Earl's health had been declining, his lungs weakened by decades of exhaust fumes and cigarette smoke. But the old man still came in every day. He sat in his chair near the bay door, watching Garrett work, nodding quietly, proud in the way men of that generation showed pride. Not with words, with presence. Then Earl died. A Tuesday morning in June. Heart attack in his sleep. The shop was in Earl's name. The debts were in Earl's name too. Creditors moved fast. The bank moved faster. Within 6 weeks, the shop was seized, the equipment sold, the building locked. Garrett had no savings, no family, no co-signer for a lease, no safety net of any kind. He applied for jobs at every garage in Toledo. Most didn't call back. 2 offered him part-time work at minimum wage, not enough to cover rent anywhere. He slept in his car until the car was repossessed. He slept in a shelter until the shelter ran out of beds. And then he slept behind a dumpster at Ridgemont High School because it was the only place where the wind didn't cut through him at night. That's how fast it happens. That's how thin the line is between having a life and having nothing. One person, one connection, one thread holding everything together. And when that thread snaps, the fall is instant and total. Garrett Slade didn't drink. He wasn't on drugs. He hadn't committed a crime. He had simply run out of people who cared whether he lived or died. And the world, as it tends to do, stepped over him and kept moving. Each morning as the sun rose over the school grounds, students passed Garrett on their way to class. Some slowed for a second, curiosity flickering across their young faces before being swallowed by discomfort. Most never looked at him at all. They laughed, checked their phones, complained about homework, and walked around his body as though he were a pothole in the sidewalk, an obstacle, a blemish, something the city should deal with, someone else's problem. Teachers arrived in their cars parking just yards away from where he slept. They gathered their bags, locked their doors, adjusted their lanyards, and walked past without a word. Not once in 3 months did anyone ask Garrett where he came from. Not once did anyone ask if he needed help. Not once did anyone ask his name. He existed within arm's reach of hundreds of people every single day and remained completely, utterly unseen. There is something deeply unsettling about how easy it is to erase a human being without ever laying a hand on them. You don't need violence. You don't need cruelty. You just need indifference. Enough people choosing to look the other way and a man disappears. Not because he left, because everyone else decided he didn't matter. Garrett Slade became invisible. Not because he faded, because the world chose not to see him. But Garrett saw everything. That's the thing nobody understood. From behind that dumpster hidden in the blind spot of a school that had forgotten he existed, Garrett Slade had been watching. 3 months of watching. 3 months of learning the rhythms of Ridgemont High School. He knew which students arrived early and which ones cut class. He knew which teachers rushed inside without looking up and which ones lingered in the parking lot on their phones. He knew the janitor's schedule. He knew when the security cameras blinked off for maintenance. And he knew about the 5 boys. He had seen them shove younger students into lockers when no adults were looking. He had watched them corner a freshman near the edge of the parking lot, blocking the kid's path, laughing as terror spread across the boy's face. He had heard them mock a student with a leg brace, imitating his limp, while their friends recorded it on their phones. He had watched a teacher notice, hesitate, and then turn away, choosing convenience over confrontation. He had seen it happen again, and again, and again. Garrett knew their names, not because anyone told him, because he listened. He heard teachers call, roll through open windows. He heard students shout to each other across the lot. He pieced together the hierarchy the way a man with nothing but time can piece together anything. And at the top of that hierarchy, untouchable and unquestioned, were 5 boys who moved through Ridgemont High School as though they owned it. Because in every way that mattered, they did. Preston Ainsworth, Nolan Whitaker, Bryce Hargrove, Colton Price, Reed Langford. They were not strangers. They were not outsiders lurking at the edge of campus. They were students, faces in the hallways, names called during attendance. Boys who wore expensive shoes and drove cars nicer than anything most of their teachers could afford. Boys whose parents sat on boards, donated to school programs, and made phone calls that carried weight. They came from families with money, serious money, the kind of money that smoothed over mistakes and softened consequences, the kind of money that made problems disappear before they ever reached the public eye. Preston Ainsworth was the leader. Tall, square-jawed, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never once being told no. His father, Douglas Ainsworth, was the most prominent defense attorney in Northwest Ohio. Douglas sat on 3 charitable boards, played golf with judges, and had a reputation for making problems vanish with a single phone call. Preston had grown up watching power work from the inside. He understood leverage before he understood algebra. 6 months earlier, Preston had put a sophomore in the hospital with a broken jaw. The boy had bumped into Preston in the hallway. That was it. A shoulder brush. An accident. Preston responded with a single punch that shattered bone. The incident barely caused a ripple. Douglas Ainsworth's office sent a paralegal to the school before the ambulance had even left the parking lot. No charges were filed. The victim's family received payment for medical bills in exchange for silence. The school filed internal paperwork that went into a drawer and never came out. Life continued. Nolan Whitaker and Colton Price were Preston's shadows. They moved together, laughed together, and inflicted cruelty together with the synchronized ease of boys who had never experienced a consequence. 3 months before the night everything changed, Nolan and Colton had cornered a student named Tanner Griggs in the boys' locker room. Tanner was 17. He had cerebral palsy. His left leg was weaker than his right, and he walked with a noticeable limp that made him slower than everyone else. Both families accepted settlement money from the Hargrove estate. Both signed non-disclosure agreements drafted by lawyers whose hourly rate exceeded most families' monthly income. Bryce stayed enrolled. His grades remained intact. His future remained untouched. The girls transferred to different schools. One of them left Toledo entirely. Reed Langford was the quietest of the 5. He rarely initiated the violence, but he never stopped it. He stood at the edge, watching, sometimes laughing softly, always present. His silence was its own form of participation. Reed's uncle sat on the Ridgemont school board. That single connection created an invisible shield around all five boys. Every complaint that reached the board was quietly redirected. Every incident report that climbed too high was sent back down with a note suggesting further review. Further review meant delay. Delay meant forgetting. Forgetting meant nothing changed. And standing at the center of this machinery of silence was Principal Warren Fisk. Fisk was 54 years old, thin and angular, with a narrow face and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look scholarly. He spoke in measured tones. He used words like stewardship and institutional integrity and the importance of due process. He was by every outward measure a reasonable man, and he was the architect of every cover-up that had kept those five boys untouchable. Fisk knew about the broken jaw. He knew about Tanner Griggs. He knew about the two girls who accused Bryce Hargrove. He had the incident reports. He had security footage from the school's own cameras. He had written statements from teachers who tried to do the right thing. And he had buried every single piece of it, not out of loyalty to those boys, out of loyalty to their family's money. $347,000 in donations over 3 years. That was the price of silence at Ridgemont High School. And Warren Fisk had accepted every cent. If you believe bullies should face consequences, if you believe silence is part of the crime, then remember this school, remember this principle, because the system that protected those five boys was not some abstract failure. It was a series of choices made by specific people who decided again and again that money mattered more than children. Now let me tell you about the girl those five boys chose as their next target. Brooke Callahan was 18 years old, a senior at Ridgemont High School, and by most outward measures, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She played volleyball. She kept her grades in the top quarter of her class. She talked about college with the quiet determination of someone who intended to get there on her own terms. She had a small circle of close friends, a sharp sense of humor, and a directness about her that some people found intimidating and others found refreshing. Brooke did not suffer fools. She never had. But Brooke carried a secret, and she carried it carefully. Her father was Wade Callahan. Most people at Ridgemont knew that Brooke's dad was a trucker. That's what she told them. Long haul, gone for days at a time, works nights. It was the kind of story that invited no follow-up questions, which was exactly the point. Because Wade Callahan was not a trucker. He was the president of the hellsangels Toledo charter. They called him Iron. Wade stood 6'3". He was built like a wall, thick through the shoulders and arms, his body a monument to decades of hard living and harder choices. His leather vest was heavy with patches, earned over 25 years of brotherhood. Skull rings wrapped 3 of his fingers. His arms were thick, corded with muscle and scars that told stories of their own. He had a voice that could fill a room without raising itself a presence, that made other men instinctively step aside, and a reputation that preceded him into every space he entered. But here is what most people never saw. Wade Callahan loved his daughter with a tenderness that would have surprised anyone who knew him only by reputation. He called her every night when he was away. He attended her volleyball games wearing a plain jacket over his vest, sitting quietly in the back row, clapping when she scored, never drawing attention to himself. He kept a photo of Brooke at age 6 in the inside pocket of his leather vest. In that photo, she was sitting on his motorcycle, both hands gripping the handlebars, grinning with 2 missing front teeth. It was the only photo he carried. Their relationship was complicated in the way that love between a parent and a child is always complicated when the parent's life doesn't fit neatly into the world the child is trying to navigate. Brooke loved her father. She respected him. She was proud of him in ways she couldn't easily explain to people who would never understand. But she also knew that his world and her world could not overlap without consequences. If her classmates knew who her father really was, everything would change. The way people looked at her, the way they talked to her, the assumptions they would make. So Brooke kept the two worlds separate, and she bore the weight of that separation quietly, the way strong people bear things they cannot change. The only visible connection between Brooke's school life and her father's world was a small worn patch stitched onto the side pocket of her backpack. A faded Harley-Davidson logo, the thread fraying at the edges, the colors dulled by years of use. Wade had given it to her when she was 12. It was not a statement. It was not a symbol she expected anyone to recognize. It was simply a piece of her father that she carried with her, close and constant, the way a soldier might carry a letter or a coin. That patch would change everything, but not yet. That Tuesday, Brooks stayed late after school for volleyball practice. The team ran drills for 2 hours, and by the time the coach blew the final whistle, the hallways had gone quiet and the building had begun to empty. Brooks' plan was simple. One of her teammates, a girl named Stacy, had offered to drive her home. It was the kind of arrangement families make every day without a second thought. But plans change, Bong. By the time Brooks showered, dressed, and walked out of the gym, Stacy was gone, left early with a headache. Another teammate had car trouble. The parking lot was nearly deserted. Brooke didn't panic. She was not the panicking type. She slung her backpack over one shoulder, pulled out her phone, and started walking toward the street. She would call her father. She would figure it out. She always did. It was late enough that the campus felt different, quieter, heavier. The air had cooled and the overhead lights buzzed with that faint electric hum that makes empty spaces feel emptier. Most of the cars were gone. Long shadows stretched across the pavement like dark fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. Brooke walked quickly but steadily, her sneakers scuffing softly on the asphalt, the rhythm of her footsteps the only sound in the stillness. She had no idea that 5 boys were watching her. They had noticed her leaving the building alone. They had watched from the shadow of the gymnasium overhang, tracking her steps, measuring the distance between her and the nearest exit. They had already decided she was vulnerable, and they had already decided what they were going to do about it. The first one stepped out from between 2 parked cars, sudden, deliberate, blocking her path. Brooke stopped. Her body registered the threat before her mind fully processed it. That involuntary tightening of the chest, that electric prickle along the back of the neck, the ancient part of the brain that knows danger before the modern part can name it. She recognized them immediately. Preston Ainsworth, Nolan Whitaker, Bryce Hargrove, Colton Price, Reed Langford. They were not strangers. They were not unknown men emerging from darkness. They were students at Ridgemont High, faces she passed in hallways every day, names she heard called during attendance, boys who sat in classrooms and ate in the cafeteria and walked the same corridors she walked. And that familiarity made what was happening worse, not better. Because it meant the danger wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from inside the walls of the place that was supposed to be safe. They closed in, not running, walking, slowly, spreading out in a loose semicircle that cut off her angles of retreat. The confidence in their movement told Brooke everything she needed to know. They had done this before. This choreography of intimidation was practiced, rehearsed, refined through repetition on targets who could not fight back. Brooke's phone felt suddenly inadequate in her hand, a flimsy shield against what was unfolding. She sensed the shift in the air the way animals sense a storm, the way laughter drains from the night, the way something unspoken but dangerous settles into the space between bodies. This was the moment where fear begins, not with screaming or chaos, but with the quiet realization that you are outnumbered, isolated, and being sized up by people who see you as prey. Preston spoke first. His voice was calm, almost amused, carrying the bored confidence of someone who had never been challenged. Walking alone, Brooke. That's not smart. Brooke didn't answer. She kept walking, her pace quickening, every instinct screaming at her to get away. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She tightened her grip on her phone, already calculating the distance to the street, ready imagining the safety of headlights and passing cars. They followed. "We're just being friendly," Nolan said, his words coated in laughter that had no warmth in it. The others laughed too, a hollow taunting sound that raised the hair on the back of Brooke's neck and made the night feel smaller, more suffocating, more final. Brooke broke into a run. They were faster. Footsteps thundered behind her, closing the distance in seconds. Hands reached out. Nolan caught her backpack strap and yanked hard. The strap dug into her shoulder, wrenching her backward. Her balance shattered. She hit the pavement hard, the impact driving the breath from her lungs in a sharp gasp. Her phone flew from her hand and skittered across the asphalt, disappearing beneath a parked car. She tried to scramble up. Panic flooded her chest like ice water. Her palms scraped against the rough ground as she pushed herself upward. Preston stepped forward. He reached into his jacket and pulled something out. A knife. The blade was about 4 inches long. Clean, sharp. When he tilted it, the streetlight caught the steel and sent a cold flash through the darkness that froze Brooke's blood. In that moment, the situation crossed a line it could never uncross. What had begun as intimidation became something far more dangerous, far more real. And if you've ever felt powerless watching bullies win, if you've ever seen silence protect the wrong people, remember this moment, because what happened next changed everything. That was when Garrett Slade woke up. He had been sleeping 20 feet away, hidden behind the dumpster, his body curled against the chill of the October night. The shouting tore him from a restless sleep. He pushed himself upright, bare feet pressing into broken glass and cigarette butts. Pain flared through his soul, sharp and immediate, but it barely registered against the surge of adrenaline that hit him the moment his eyes adjusted to the darkness. 5 boys, 1 girl on the ground, a knife. Garrett had nothing, no weapon, no shoes, no phone to call for help, no one who would come running if he shouted into the night. For 3 months he had been invisible, ignored, treated like part of the refuse piled around him. He was a ghost, a stain, a problem someone else was supposed to handle. But here is what you need to understand about Garrett Slade. This was not a split-second reflex. This was not a man stumbling into a situation he didn't understand. Garrett had spent 3 months watching those 5 boys. He had cataloged their cruelty with the quiet precision of someone who had nothing to do but observe. He knew what they were capable of. He had seen the fear they manufactured. He had watched them operate with impunity while every adult in that building chose to look the other way. And every single day as he lay behind that dumpster watching the machinery of indifference grind forward, something inside Garrett Slade had been building. Not rage, something quieter than rage, something steadier, a line, a boundary drawn in the deepest part of himself that said, if this happens, if they go this far, if they corner someone who cannot get away, I will not lie here and watch. By that night, Garrett Slade had nothing left to lose. No home, no job, no family, no future that anyone would miss if it ended in a parking lot behind a dumpster. And sometimes having nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing a man can have, because it strips away every reason to stay down, every calculation about risk and reward, every excuse that keeps good people frozen while bad things happen to others. He rose to his feet, he straightened his back, and he walked out from behind the dumpster. No hesitation, no shouting, just steady, deliberate movement. Barefoot and bleeding already from cuts no one would notice. Heading straight toward the group gathered under the flickering streetlight. Leave her alone. The voice was quiet, calm, almost gentle. It did not match the chaos of the moment, and that was precisely what made it cut through the night like a blade of its own. Every head turned. Preston saw him first, a barefoot man emerging from the shadows. Dirty, thin, bleeding from the soles of his feet, wearing the same stained clothes he had worn every day for 3 months. Preston laughed, a short, sharp sound filled with the kind of contempt that only comes from someone who has never been made to feel small. "The hell are you?" Preston sneered, the knife still in his hand, his body still turned toward Brooke. "Go back to your dumpster trash." Garrett didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He stepped forward instead, placing his body between Preston and Brooke, blocking the knife with nothing but skin and bone, and a decision that had already been made. "I said leave her alone." The words were steady, final. The kind of words that come from a place so deep they cannot be argued with, only answered. For a split second, everything hung suspended. Breath, shadow, the faint buzz of the streetlight overhead. 5 boys staring at a man who had nothing and was offering everything. That was when Colton Busten pulled a second knife. It happened fast, faster than fear could fully register. Garrett reacted on instinct. He turned and shoved Brooke backward with every ounce of force his weakened body could produce. She stumbled, caught herself, and then she was moving, scrambling to her feet, turning, running. Preston lunged. The blade drove into Garrett's side just below his ribs. The impact stole the air from his lungs. A wet, burning pain bloomed through his torso, hot and deep and spreading. Before he could draw another breath, Nolan slashed at his arm. Blood sprayed across the pavement, dark and sudden, marking the ground in a pattern that would still be visible the next morning. Garrett did not scream. He reached out with his bleeding arm and clamped his hand around Preston's wrist. His fingers were slick. His grip was desperate, but he held on with everything he had left, planting his bare feet on the broken asphalt, refusing to let go, refusing to fall, buying seconds with his body because seconds were all he had to give. Run. The word was not shouted. It was pushed out of him like the last breath from a collapsing lung, directed at the girl who was already 30 feet away, looking back over her shoulder, frozen in terror at the sight of this stranger. This nobody. This invisible man who was bleeding and fighting and dying for her. Run. Something in his voice broke through. Brooke turned and ran. Harder, faster, away from the parking lot, away from the knives, away from the boys who had chosen her as their target. The moment she was out of sight, everything unraveled. Panic replaced bravado. The reality of what they had done crashed through the adrenaline like cold water. Preston wrenched his arm free. The five of them scattered, bolting in different directions, disappearing into the darkness like roaches when the light comes on. Sudden cowards, fleeing consequences they had never been forced to face. Garrett collapsed. His legs gave out and he hit the pavement hard. Blood pooled beneath him, spreading into the cracks of the asphalt, dark and warm and uncontainable. His vision blurred. The world narrowed to sound and shadow, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of wind through dry leaves. Somewhere far away, a dog barking at nothing. As he lay there struggling to keep his eyes open, his thoughts drifted to something small and strange. The patch on her backpack. The worn Harley-Davidson logo, its stitching frayed, its colors faded. He had seen it as he pushed her away. It meant nothing to him. A brand. A symbol he recognized but did not understand. Not yet. As his eyes closed and the darkness swallowed him whole, he did not know that that small piece of thread and fabric had just connected him to a world that was about to descend on Toledo like a storm. Brooke Callahan ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled beneath her. She burst through the parking lot exit, stumbled onto the sidewalk, and nearly collided with an older woman walking a dog. The woman grabbed Brooke's arm to steady her and saw the terror etched across the girl's face. "Call 911, Brooke gasped. "Someone's been stabbed. Behind the school. Please." The woman fumbled for her phone. Brooke didn't wait. She grabbed the phone from the woman's shaking hands and dialed herself, her voice cracking but coherent as she gave the dispatcher the address, the location, the number of attackers, the weapon. She was precise. She was clear. She was 18 years old, and she was holding herself together through sheer willpower, because falling apart was not something Brooke Callahan knew how to do. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes. Brooke led the paramedics to the parking lot. She showed them where Garrett lay. She stood and watched as they worked on him, loading him onto a stretcher, pressing gauze against wounds that would not stop bleeding. She did not look away. She watched every second of it. And when the ambulance doors closed and the sirens split the night, Brooke Callahan did something that surprised even herself. She followed. She got in her teammate's car, the one with the dead battery that someone had jump-started while she was gone, and she drove to Toledo Memorial Hospital. She parked in the emergency lot and walked into the waiting room and sat down in a hard plastic chair, and she did not leave. Not when a nurse told her visiting hours were over. Not when a security guard suggested she go home. Not when midnight passed and the fluorescent lights made her eyes ache and her body scream for sleep. Brooke Callahan sat in that waiting room for 6 hours because a man she had never met had taken a knife for her, and she was not going to let him wake up alone. Garrett Slade survived. Barely. The EMTs had found him unconscious, his body surrounded by blood that had soaked deep into the pavement. 1 stab wound to the torso. 3 deep slash wounds across his arms and chest. His pulse was thready, his breathing shallow and irregular. They worked with practiced urgency, loading him into the ambulance, fighting to stabilize him as the vehicle screamed through the streets of Toledo. At the hospital, doctors rushed him into emergency surgery. 17 stitches closed torn flesh. A blood transfusion replaced what his body had lost. Nearly 30% of his blood volume was gone by the time they stabilized him. For hours, his life hung in a fragile balance dependent on machines and pressure and the steady hands of surgeons who did not know his name. 8 hours later, Garrett opened his eyes. The room was white, bright. The air smelled of antiseptic and something floral he couldn't identify. Machines beeped softly beside him. An IV line ran into his left arm. His body felt heavy, distant, wrapped in a dull ache that pulsed with every heartbeat. The first face he saw was not a doctor's. It belonged to a girl sitting in a chair near the window. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She was wearing the same clothes she'd worn the night before, and she was watching him with an expression he couldn't read. Something between gratitude and guilt and a fierce burning determination that seemed too large for her young face. "You're awake," Brooke said quietly. She leaned forward. Her eyes were red but dry. "I've been here since they brought you in." Garrett tried to speak. His throat was raw, scorched from the breathing tube they had removed hours earlier. The words came out cracked and barely audible. "Are you okay?" Brooks stared at him. A man who had been stabbed, who had lost a third of his blood, who was lying in a hospital bed with 17 stitches holding his body together, and his first question was whether she was okay. Something tightened in her chest. Something shifted behind her eyes. "Because of you," she said. "I'm okay because of you." Before Garrett could respond, the door opened. The man who entered filled the doorframe the way a boulder fills a riverbed. Completely. Immovably. Wade Callahan stood 6'3", his leather vest heavy with decades of patches, skull rings on 3 fingers, arms thick with muscle and scar tissue. His boots struck the linoleum with a weight that seemed to press the air out of the room. Brooks stood immediately. "Dad." Garrett watched as the massive man crossed the room and wrapped his daughter in an embrace that was both crushing and impossibly gentle. Wade held her for a long moment, his eyes closed, his jaw locked tight, his massive body trembling with something he was fighting to contain. When he finally released her, his eyes were red but dry. The grief and fury inside him were visible in every locked muscle, every white-knuckled fist. But he held it all with the discipline of a man who had learned long ago that control was the most dangerous weapon he owned. Wade turned to the bed. He looked at Garrett for a long moment. The homeless man? The nobody. The invisible figure who had been sleeping behind a dumpster for 3 months. The man who had stepped between a knife and a stranger's daughter, with nothing to gain and everything to lose. "You saved my daughter," Wade said. His voice cracked despite himself. "A fracture running through stone. You don't know me. You don't know her. You had every reason to keep walking." He swallowed hard. His hands opened and closed at his sides. The skull rings caught the fluorescent light. "But you didn't." Garrett tried to respond. His throat burned. The words wouldn't form. Wade lifted a hand, stopping him gently. "Not yet. Don't try to talk yet." Wade pulled a chair close to the bed and sat. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice dropping to something low and private and absolutely certain. "The boys who did this, I need to know everything." Garrett told him, slowly, between shallow breaths and wincing pauses. He described the parking lot, the semicircle, the laughter. The way they had moved with practiced coordination. The knives, he named them: Preston Ainsworth, Nolan Whitaker, Bryce Hargrove, Colton Price, Reed Langford. He described each one. He told Wade what he had observed over 3 months. The pattern of bullying, the disabled student, the teachers who looked away, the principal who buried everything. Wade listened without interrupting. His face was stone. When Garrett finished, Wade nodded slowly. He reached into his vest and pulled out his phone. He stood. Brooke grabbed his arm. "Dad, wait." Wade looked down at his daughter. The fury behind his eyes was barely leashed. It radiated from him like heat from a furnace. Brooke held his gaze. She did not flinch. She did not waver. "I know what you want to do. I know who you're going to call. And I'm not asking you not to, but listen to me first." Wade waited. The room was silent except for the steady beep of Garrett's heart monitor. "Those boys have gotten away with everything for 3 years because adults handled it the adult way. Money, lawyers, phone calls, backroom deals. Every time someone tried to do something, their parents made it disappear." She paused, her voice steady and clear. "If you roll up with 200 bikes tomorrow morning and they all get arrested on the spot, their father's lawyers will have them out on bail by dinner. Insufficient evidence, coerced testimony, intimidation by a criminal organization. They'll spin it, Dad. They always do. Wade's jaw tightened. So what are you saying? Give me 24 hours, Brooks said. Let me build a case they can't buy their way out of. Evidence, witnesses, documentation. I know that school. I know those kids. I know who's been hurt and who's been silenced. Let me do this right. And then when you come, bring everyone. Bring the thunder. But let me give the police something so solid that no lawyer on earth can make it disappear. Wade stared at his daughter, 18 years old, standing in a hospital room, her eyes red from a sleepless night, her body still shaking from what had happened to her less than 24 hours ago. And she was not asking to hide. She was not asking to be protected. She was asking to lead. Something moved behind Wade's eyes, something deeper than pride. A recognition, perhaps, that his daughter had inherited more from him than his stubbornness. She had inherited his refusal to let the wrong thing stand. 24 hours, Wade said finally, not a minute more. He lifted his phone. But I'm making the call now. They'll be ready when you are. He stepped into the hallway. Brooke heard his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of absolute authority. Brothers, tomorrow evening, Ridgemont, full charter. Bring everyone. He ended the call and looked back through the doorway at his daughter. She was already pulling out her phone, already making a list, already planning her next 12 moves, while the rest of the world was still catching up to what had happened in that parking lot. Wade shook his head slowly. A ghost of something, almost like a smile, crossed his weathered face. Then it was gone, replaced by the hard mask he showed the world. In the hospital room, Brooks sat back down beside Garrett's bed. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Confusion, admiration, the dawning awareness that the girl he had saved was not someone who needed saving in any permanent sense. She was someone who had been knocked down and was already getting back up. Who are you? Garrett asked, his voice barely a rasp. Brooke looked at him. My name is Brooke Callahan. My dad is the president of the Hellsangels Toledo Charter. And that patch on my backpack, the one you probably saw last night, that's not decoration. That's family. Garrett closed his eyes. A faint, exhausted breath escaped him that might have been a laugh. Of all the girls in Toledo, he whispered. Brooke didn't smile, not yet. She leaned forward, her voice quiet but fierce. You almost died for me. I'm not going to let that be for nothing. 24 hours. I'm going to get every piece of evidence those boys in that school have been hiding. And then my father and 250 of his closest friends are going to make sure the whole world sees it. She stood up and slung her backpack over her shoulder. The faded Harley-Davidson patch caught the light from the hospital window. She paused at the door and looked back. Get some rest, Garrett. You did the hard part. My turn now. Brooke Callahan walked out of Toledo Memorial Hospital at dawn. The sky was gray-pink, the air cold enough to sting her cheeks. She had not slept. Her body ached. Her mind was racing. Behind her in a hospital bed, a man who owned nothing had given everything. Ahead of her, inside a school she had attended for 4 years, the truth was buried under 3 years of money and silence and institutional cowardice. She had 24 hours. She had her father's trust. She had a phone full of contacts. And she had something none of those 5 boys or their powerful families had ever encountered before. A girl who refused to be silent. The clock was ticking, and Brooke Callahan was already moving. The next morning, the sun rose over Ridgemont High School the way it always did. Golden light crept across the front steps, warming the brick facade, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers reaching for something they could never quite grasp. The American flag above the entrance hung limp in the windless air. Buses pulled up to the curb. Car doors slammed. Backpacks bounced against young shoulders as students filed through the front doors, laughing, arguing, scrolling through phones, living their ordinary lives on what appeared to be an ordinary Wednesday morning. Preston Ainsworth walked through those doors at 7:52. His posture was relaxed. His expression was calm. He wore a fresh polo shirt, clean sneakers, and the easy confidence of a boy who had never once worried about consequences catching up to him. He nodded to a classmate in the hallway. He stopped at his locker, spun the combination with practiced ease, and pulled out his history textbook. His hands were steady. His eyes showed nothing, not guilt, not fear, not even the faintest flicker of concern. As far as Preston Ainsworth was concerned, last night had already been filed away in the same mental cabinet as every other incident. A thing that happened, a thing that didn't matter, a thing that would go away on its own because things always went away. Nolan Whitaker was already at his locker 2 rows down, laughing loudly with a group of friends about something that had happened in a video game the night before. His voice carried through the hallway with the careless volume of someone who had never been asked to lower it. Bryce Hargrove sat in the cafeteria eating a breakfast sandwich, scrolling through his phone, his face blank and untroubled. Colton Price and Reed Langford entered together through the east doors, backpacks slung over their shoulders, talking about a party plan for the weekend. Not one of them looked worried. Not one of them glanced over a shoulder or spoke in hushed tones or showed any sign that they had stabbed a man and left him bleeding in a parking lot less than 12 hours ago. Why would they? They had been here before. Different nights, different victims, same outcome. The machine would protect them. The machine always protected them. Principal Warren Fisk arrived at 7:30, parked in his reserved space near the front entrance, and walked into the building carrying a leather briefcase and a tall cup of coffee. He had already received a call from the Toledo Police Department the previous evening. He knew that a homeless man had been stabbed behind his school. He knew that 5 of his students were the primary suspects. He knew that a girl named Brooke Callahan had been the target. He did nothing. He unlocked his office. He sat behind his desk. He sipped his coffee and opened his email and began sorting through the morning's administrative tasks as though the world outside his window had not fundamentally shifted. Because in Warren Fisk's experience, the world did not shift. Not when the right people made the right calls, not when the machinery was oiled and the levers were pulled and the checks cleared. He had managed situations like this before. He would manage this one too. At 8:15, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a name he recognized immediately, Douglas Ainsworth. Fisk answered on the second ring. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Fisk said very little. He listened. He nodded. He made small sounds of agreement. When the call ended, he set down the phone and stared at the wall for a long moment. Then he picked up his desk phone and dialed the school's IT office. Harlan, he said when the line connected. I need you to pull the security footage from the rear parking lot. Last night between 7 and 10 p.m., all cameras. There was a pause on the other end. Harlan Mosley, 58 years old and 6 months from retirement, sat in his small office surrounded by monitors and server racks in the accumulated dust of a man who had been doing the same job for 19 years. Pull it and do what with it? Sir Harlan asked. Delete it, Fisk said. His voice was flat, practiced. All of it. And make sure the backup drive is wiped clean. Silence. Then understood, Harlan said quietly. He hung up. Warren Fisk leaned back in his chair. He took another sip of coffee. The morning bell rang. Classes began. The machinery rolled forward. But what Fisk did not know, what Douglas Ainsworth did not know, what none of them knew, was that a girl who had not slept in 30 hours was already 3 steps ahead of all of them. Brooke Callahan arrived at Ridgemont High School at 7:45 that morning. She had gone home only long enough to shower and change clothes. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her body was running on adrenaline and black coffee and something harder than both. A purpose so sharp and clear it cut through the exhaustion like a blade through fog. She had a plan. She had spent the pre-dawn hours in the hospital parking lot building it piece by piece in her mind, testing each step against every way it could fail, preparing contingencies for contingencies the way her father had taught her without ever knowing he was teaching her. Wade Callahan did not raise a timid child. He raised a girl who understood that when the world decides to be unfair, you do not wait for the world to change its mind. You change the game. Brooke walked through the front doors of Ridgemont High carrying her backpack with the faded Harley-Davidson patch visible on the side pocket. She walked past the main office where the receptionist was sorting mail. She walked past the trophy case and the bulletin board covered in flyers for the winter formal. She walked past a group of freshman girls, whispering about a rumor they had heard about something happening in the parking lot last night. She walked with the measured calm of someone who knew exactly where she was going and exactly what she intended to do when she got there. Her first stop was the library. Tanner Griggs always arrived at school early. He came before the hallways filled, before the bodies crowded close enough to bump his weaker leg, before the noise and chaos of 1,000 teenagers made navigating the building an obstacle course of anxiety. The library was his refuge. He sat at the same table every morning, near the back wall, next to the biography section, where the light from the high windows fell in long rectangles across the carpet. He read. He breathed. He existed in the only space in the entire school where no one bothered him. Brooke found him there at 7:50. He was reading a paperback, his backpack on the chair beside him, his bad legs stretched out beneath the table. When he saw Brooke approaching, his body stiffened. Not because he was afraid of her specifically, but because any unexpected approach triggered the same defensive reflex that 3 years of bullying had wired into his nervous system. Tanner Brooks said, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down without waiting for an invitation. She kept her voice low, private, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made him close his book. "I need to talk to you about what happened to you in the locker room." Tanner's face went blank. It was a practiced blankness, the kind of expression that takes months of pain to perfect, the mask a person wears when the mere mention of a memory threatens to crack them open. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. His voice was flat, rehearsed. Brooke did not push. She did not argue. She leaned forward and spoke the only words that mattered. "Last night, 5 boys attacked me in the parking lot behind the school. Preston, Nolan, Bryce, Colton, and Reed. They had knives. They would have done whatever they wanted to me if a homeless man hadn't stepped between us and taken those knives himself. He's in the hospital right now. 17 stitches. He almost bled to death. And those 5 boys walked into this school this morning like nothing happened. Because nothing ever happens to them. Does it, Tanner?" Silence. Tanner's fingers tightened on the edge of his book. His knuckles went white. Brooke continued, "I know what they did to you. I know the school buried it. I know your family was pressured to stay quiet. And I know you've spent the last 3 months walking these hallways terrified that it'll happen again and nobody will do anything. Again." Tanner's jaw trembled, a barely perceptible vibration that he fought to control. "Don't," he whispered, his voice cracked around the word. "You don't know what they'll do if I talk." Brooke reached across the table. She didn't touch him. She simply placed her hand flat on the surface between them, open, steady, and offering. A man who sleeps behind a dumpster and owns nothing in this world except the clothes on his back stood up last night and put himself between a knife and a stranger. He didn't know me. He didn't know my father. He had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And he did it anyway. She paused, letting the weight of it settle. "You and I, Tanner, we at least have a voice. We at least have the ability to say what happened. If a man with nothing can risk everything, then we can risk telling the truth." Tanner stared at her hand on the table. A long moment passed. The clock on the library wall ticked. Somewhere in the hallway, a locker slammed. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary school morning pressing against the extraordinary thing that was unfolding in this quiet corner of the library. Tanner looked up. His eyes were wet, but there was something else there too. Something that had been buried for months beneath the fear and the silence and the crushing weight of institutional betrayal. Something that Brooke's words had reached down and touched. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Brooke pulled a small notebook from her backpack. Everything she said, from the beginning, every detail you remember. Names, dates, what they did, what the school did after, who told you to stay quiet, all of it. Tanner Griggs talked for 22 minutes. He spoke quietly, haltingly at first, then with increasing steadiness as the dam inside him broke and the truth poured out in a torrent of details he had been carrying alone for far too long. Brooke wrote everything down. She did not interrupt. She did not react visibly to the worst parts, though her pen pressed harder against the page when Tanner described being left naked on the locker room floor, shaking, unable to stand, waiting for someone to find him. She wrote it all down because every word was a brick, and she was building something these boys and their families had never faced before. A wall they could not buy their way through. By 9 o'clock, Brooke had spoken to 3 more students. She found them the way someone finds anything in a high school. Through whispers. Through the invisible network of shared pain that connects victims even when they don't know each other's names. A sophomore girl who had been shoved down a stairwell by Nolan and told if she reported it worse would follow. A junior boy whose phone had been smashed by Preston for recording an incident in the cafeteria. A freshman who had transferred from another school and been targeted on his very first day because he made the mistake of sitting in a seat Colton Price considered his. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Fear first, then resistance. Then the moment when Brooke told them about Garrett Slade. the man behind the dumpster. The man who had nothing and gave everything. And each time something shifted in their eyes. Not courage exactly, something more fragile than courage. Permission. The realization that if someone with nothing could stand up, then maybe, just maybe, someone with something could too. 4 testimonies, 4 stories, 4 bricks added to the wall. But Brooke knew that testimonies alone wouldn't be enough. She had grown up watching her father navigate conflicts. She understood how power worked. Testimonies could be discredited. Witnesses could be intimidated. Memories could be questioned and picked apart by lawyers who billed $800 an hour. She needed something harder, something that could not be dismissed or distorted or bought off. She needed the footage. At 10:15 between second and third period, Brooke walked into the school's administrative hallway and stopped outside a door marked Information Technology Services. She knocked twice and opened it without waiting for a response. Harlan Mosley looked up from his desk with the startled expression of a man who was not accustomed to visitors. His office was small, cluttered with cables and outdated hardware manuals, and the general disorder of someone who had long since stopped caring about appearances. His reading glasses sat crooked on his nose. A half-eaten granola bar rested on a stack of papers beside his keyboard. "Mr. Mosley," Brooke said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Harlan leaned back in his chair. He studied the girl standing in front of him. He knew her. Not well. The way a man who had worked in a school for 19 years knew most of the students. A face in the crowd, a name on a roster. But something about her expression made him sit up straighter. There was a directness in her eyes that he recognized. The look of someone who had already made a decision and was simply delivering the notification. "This morning, Principal Fisk called you and told you to delete the security footage from the rear parking lot," Brooke said. Her voice was calm, not accusing, not threatening, just stating a fact the way one might state that the sky was blue or that water was wet. Harlan Mosley's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: surprise, fear, and then something else, something older and wearier that settled over his features like a shadow. He said nothing. Brooke continued. 5 students attacked me in that parking lot last night. They had knives. A homeless man intervened and nearly died protecting me. The footage from those cameras would show everything. And Principal Fisk told you to destroy it, not to preserve it for a police investigation, not to hand it over to detectives, to destroy it, because Douglas Ainsworth called him this morning and told him to make it disappear. The way they've made everything disappear for the last 3 years. Harlan stared at her. His mouth was a thin line. His hands were flat on his desk, fingers spread as though he were bracing himself against something invisible. "I know you've seen things," Brooks said. 19 years in this building. You've watched the cameras. You've pulled footage. You've been told to delete things before, and you've done it because you needed this job and you had 6 months until retirement, and the pension and the benefits and everything that comes with keeping your head down and doing what you're told." Harlan's breath was shallow. His eyes glistened behind his glasses. Brooke leaned forward. "But last night, a man who sleeps behind a dumpster decided that keeping his head down wasn't an option anymore. He had more to lose than you do, Mr. Mosley. He didn't have a pension. He didn't have a house. He didn't have shoes. And he stood up anyway." The silence in that small office was enormous. It pressed against the walls. It filled the space between them with the weight of a question that had no comfortable answer. Then Harlan Mosley opened his desk drawer. He reached inside and pulled out a USB drive. Small, black, unremarkable. The kind of object you could lose in a coat pocket and never notice. He placed it on the desk between them. "I copied everything before I wiped the servers," he said. His voice was quiet but steady. 19 years I've worked in this building. 19 years I've watched that man bury things that should have seen the light of day. I kept copies of other things too. Footage from the locker room incident with the Griggs boy. Footage from the stairwell. Timestamps. File logs showing when deletions were ordered and by whom. He pushed the USB drive across the desk toward Brooke. "I'm 58 years old. I've got 6 months left in this place. And I am tired of being the man who helps them hide." Brooke picked up the USB drive. It weighed almost nothing. It held everything. She looked at Harlan Mosley and nodded once, the kind of nod that carries more gratitude than words can hold. Then she slipped the drive into her pocket and left the office, closing the door softly behind her. 5 bricks, 6 bricks. The wall was growing. But while Brooke was building her case inside the school, something was happening 12 miles away at Toledo Memorial Hospital that nearly destroyed everything. At 11 o'clock that morning, a man in a charcoal gray suit walked into Garrett Slade's hospital room. He was tall, lean, and precise in the way that expensive lawyers are precise. Every crease in his suit was deliberate. Every word he spoke was measured. His name was Arthur Kendrick, and he was a senior partner at Ainsworth and Associates, the firm owned by Douglas Ainsworth, Preston's father. Kendrick carried a thin leather briefcase. He sat down in the chair beside Garrett's bed without being invited and crossed one leg over the other with the casual authority of a man who is accustomed to controlling rooms. "Mr. Slade," he said, his voice smooth and professionally warm, "I'm here to discuss the incident from last night and to explore a resolution that benefits everyone involved." Garrett was still connected to an IV. His side throbbed where the stitches pulled tight against swollen flesh. His arm was wrapped in gauze that had already bled through once and been changed by a nurse an hour earlier. He looked at the lawyer with the dull alertness of a man who was in too much pain to be polite, but too stubborn to close his eyes. "Resolution," Garrett repeated. Kendrick opened his briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper. He placed it on the hospital tray beside Garrett's bed and turned it so the text faced the patient. "This is a settlement agreement," Kendrick explained. "My clients are prepared to offer you $5,000 in exchange for your signed agreement not to pursue criminal charges or civil action related to the events of last night. The funds would be available immediately." He paused, letting the number hang in the air. For a man in your current situation, this could represent a meaningful, fresh start. Garrett stared at the paper. He did not touch it. He did not reach for the pen that Kendrick had placed beside it with surgical precision. $5,000. To a man who had nothing, it was an enormous sum. It was a roof over his head. It was meals for months. It was shoes. It was warmth. It was the first rung of a ladder he had been staring up at from the bottom for 3 months. $5,000 could change his life, and all he had to do was sign his name and let 5 boys walk away from what they had done. Again. Garrett looked at the lawyer. He thought about the parking lot, the way Preston had laughed when he saw him, the contempt in that laugh. "Go back to your dumpster trash." He thought about Brooke on the ground, the knife above her, the terror in her eyes. He thought about Tanner Griggs, the boy he had watched through chain-link fences and dirty windows, the boy who limped through hallways where no one protected him. He thought about 3 months of watching evil operate unchallenged because everyone with the power to stop it had decided it was easier not to try. And he thought about Earl Bridger, the quiet old man who had handed him a wrench and said, "If you can learn to fix what's broken, you'll never be useless." Garrett pushed the paper back across the tray. "No." Kendrick's expression didn't change. His smile remained fixed, professional, patient. "Mr. Slade, I understand this is an emotional time, but I wanted to be candid with you. You are currently homeless. You have no employment, no fixed address, and no legal representation. In a courtroom, your testimony would carry very little weight against 5 young men from established families with clean records. This offer is generous, and I strongly recommend you consider it carefully before making a decision you may regret." The words were spoken gently, but the threat beneath them was as sharp as any knife Preston Ainsworth had ever carried. "We are powerful. You are nothing. No one will believe you. Take the money and disappear." Garrett looked at the lawyer for a longer time. The machines beat beside him. The IV dripped. His body ached with every breath. "I don't need anyone to believe me," Garrett said. His voice was raw and quiet, barely more than a whisper. But the words were iron. "I just need to tell the truth. And I'm not signing anything that lets those boys pretend last night didn't happen." Kendrick's smile thinned. He reached for the paper. "Mr. Slade, you're making a mistake that..." He didn't finish the sentence. The door to the hospital room opened and a woman walked in. She was 5'9", broad-shouldered, with short-cropped auburn hair and a leather vest covered in patches. A Hell's Angels death head was stitched across the back. Her boots were steel-toed. Her eyes were hard. Her name was Denise Paxton. They called her Gears. Wade Callahan had sent her to watch over Garrett the moment he left the hospital that morning. Denise looked at the lawyer. She looked at the paper on the tray. She looked at Garrett. Then she turned back to Kendrick with an expression that made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "Visiting hours for lawyers nobody invited end right now," she said. Her voice was calm and carried the absolute certainty of a woman who had never once bluffed in her life. "You've got about 10 seconds to pick up your little paper and walk out that door before I call every brother within 100 miles and tell them Douglas Ainsworth sent a man in a suit to intimidate a stabbing victim in his hospital bed." Kendrick stood. He straightened his tie. He returned the settlement agreement to his briefcase with movements that were controlled but noticeably quicker than before. He left the room without another word. Denise watched him go. Then she turned to Garrett and shook her head slowly. $5,000, she said. "That's what they think a man's spine is worth." Garrett closed his eyes. The pain in his side pulsed hot and deep. But somewhere beneath the pain, something else burned. A quiet, fierce gratitude that he was not alone in this. That someone was standing in the doorway. That for the first time in 3 months, the world had not simply stepped over him and kept walking. Denise pulled out her phone and sent a text. 3 words. They tried. He held. Back at Ridgemont High, Brooke was in the middle of her most important conversation yet. Mrs. Lorraine Beckett taught English literature in room 214. She was 51 years old with reading glasses that perpetually slid down her nose and a voice that could make Shakespeare sound like a conversation over coffee. She had been teaching at Ridgemont for 14 years. She was good at her job. She cared about her students, and she had been carrying a weight that was slowly crushing her. Brooke found her during the lunch period alone in her classroom, eating a sandwich at her desk and grading papers. Brooke closed the door behind her. The click of the latch was soft but decisive. "Mrs. Beckett," Brooke said, "I need your help." Lorraine Beckett looked up. She saw the girl standing before her and something crossed her face. A flicker of recognition. Not of Brooke specifically, but of the moment. The kind of moment she had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure for years. "What kind of help?" Lorraine asked carefully. Brooke sat down in a student desk in the front row, her backpack resting against her leg, and told Lorraine everything. The attack, the knives, Garrett Slade, the hospital, the 5 boys walking into school that morning as though the world had not just cracked beneath their feet. She told her about Tanner Griggs, about the other students she had spoken to, about the USB drive in her pocket containing footage that proved the school had been systematically bearing violence for 3 years. Then Brooke said the words that broke through every wall Lorraine Beckett had built around herself. "I know you tried to report them," Brooke said. "I know you went to Fisk and he told you to drop it. I know he threatened your career. I know you've been watching those boys hurt people and hating yourself for not doing more." She paused. "I'm not here to judge you for staying silent, Mrs. Beckett. I'm here because you don't have to stay silent anymore." Lorraine's hands were trembling. The sandwich she had been holding sat forgotten on its wrapper. Her eyes filled with tears that she blinked back furiously. Her jaw set, her pride fighting against the emotion that was breaking through every defense she had. "You don't understand," Lorraine said, her voice shaking. "I filed reports. 3 times. I documented everything. Preston harassing students. The pattern of intimidation. I gave Fisk names and dates and specific incidents. Each time he called me into his office and told me the same thing. Drop it. These families are important to the school's funding. If I'd pushed harder, he said I'd be transferred to a school so far from Toledo, I'd need a map to find it. He said my pension review was coming up, and it would be a shame if complications arose." She pressed her hands flat on her desk, steadying herself. "I have 18 months until I can retire with full benefits. 18 months. I've given this school 14 years of my life, Brooke, and that man used my own future as a weapon against me." Brooke did not look away. She held Lorraine's gaze with the steady, unflinching directness of someone who understood exactly what was at stake and was asking anyway. "I know what he did to you," Brooke said, "and I know what it cost you to stay quiet. But right now, there is a 23-year-old man in a hospital bed who had nothing. No pension, no career, no 18 months of anything. And he stood up. He didn't calculate the risk. He didn't weigh the consequences. He just did the right thing because someone needed him to." She let the silence breathe for a moment. "I'm asking you to do the same thing. Not because it's easy, because it's right. And because I have enough evidence now that when you speak, you won't be alone. You'll be one of many, and they can't bury all of us. Lorraine Beckett sat very still. The clock above the whiteboard ticked. The sound of students in the hallway filtered through the closed door, muffled and distant, the noise of a world that was about to change and didn't know it yet. Then Lorraine opened her desk drawer and pulled out a file folder. It was thick, dog-eared, the edges worn from handling. She placed it on the desk and slid it toward Brooke. Everything I documented, Lorraine said. 14 years of incidents. Reports I filed that were sent back. Emails from Fisk instructing me to stand down. Dates, names, descriptions. I kept copies of everything because I knew that someday someone would come looking for the truth. She took a shaky breath and removed her glass of wiping them with a tissue. And Brooke, I'm not the only teacher who kept records. Chet Maddox. Coach Maddox, he has files too. So does Patricia Wellman in the science department. So does Frank O'Brien in the guidance office. Fisk threatened all of us. We all kept quiet, and we all kept copies. The wall was no longer just bricks. It was a fortress. Brooke left Lorraine Beckett's classroom at 12:45 with a folder so thick she had to carry it with both hands. She moved quickly through the hallways, her mind racing ahead to the next step and the step after that. She had testimonies from victims. She had security footage on a USB drive. She had 14 years of documented complaints from a teacher willing to go on the record, and she was about to receive the final piece. At 1:15, Brooke's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief. Meet me at the Starbucks on Monroe Street. 2 o'clock. I have something you need. Come alone. Brooke stared at the screen. She didn't recognize the number, but she recognized the area code. It belonged to the same neighborhood where the Langford family lived. Reed Langford's family. She almost didn't go. Every survival instinct told her it could be a trap. Another move by the families to silence her, to threaten her, to take away the evidence before it could reach anyone who mattered. But Brooke Callahan had inherited her father's ability to read situations, and something about the message felt different. Not aggressive, not threatening, desperate. She went. The Starbucks on Monroe Street was half empty at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon. Brooke sat at a corner table, her backpack between her feet, the USB drive and the folder tucked inside it pressed against her spine like armor. She watched the door. At 2:03, a woman walked in. Vivian Langford was 52 years old. She was tall and thin, immaculately dressed in a camel-colored coat and pearl earrings, the kind of woman who looked as though she had been assembled from the pages of a catalog for people who had never known discomfort. Her hands were manicured. Her posture was perfect. Her face was the controlled mask of someone who had spent decades performing composure as though it were a profession. But her eyes were red, and when she sat down across from Brooke, her hands were shaking. I know who you are, Vivian said. Her voice was low, precise, clipped at the edges with the effort of holding itself together. I know what my son did last night, and I know what he's been doing for the last 3 years. Brooke said nothing. She waited. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a conversation is let the silence work. Vivian reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. She placed it on the table between them and kept her fingers pressed against it as though letting go would make it irreversible, which of course it would. Inside this envelope, Vivian said, is every financial record related to donations made by the families of those 5 boys to Ridgemont High School and to Warren Fisk's personal accounts over the last 3 years. $347,000 in direct contributions to school programs, all timed within days of specific incidents being reported and then buried. There are also 3 payments totaling $42,000 made directly to a private account in Fisk's name. I found them in my husband's home office. He doesn't know I have them. Brooke looked at the envelope. Then she looked at the woman sitting across from her, the perfectly constructed exterior, the trembling hands, the red eyes that spoke of a night spent staring at the ceiling and confronting truths that could no longer be avoided. Why, Brooke asked. The question was simple, but it contained everything. Vivian's composure cracked. Not dramatically, not with sobbing or wailing. It cracked the way stone cracks, silently, deeply, a fracture that runs all the way through. Because I watched my son become a monster, Vivian said. Her voice was barely a whisper. I watched it happen year by year, incident by incident. And every time my husband fixed it, he made calls, he wrote checks, he told Reed that everything was fine, that boys made mistakes, that this was just how things worked. She paused, her fingers tightening on the envelope. And I said nothing. I told myself it would get better, that he would grow out of it, that the next time would be different. But it never got different. It only got worse. And last night, my son held a knife in a parking lot, and a homeless man almost died because of him. A single tear fell onto the back of Vivian's hand. She did not wipe it away. I cannot undo what I allowed to happen, she said, but I can make sure it stops. Today. She released the envelope and pushed it across the table to Brooke. Vivian stood. She straightened her coat. She looked at Brooke with an expression that held no expectation of forgiveness. I don't expect you to understand, Vivian said, but I need you to know that not every mother in those families is asleep. Some of us are just now waking up. She turned and walked out of the Starbucks. She did not look back. Brooke watched her go. Then she opened the envelope and began reading. The numbers were precise. The dates were specific. The connections were undeniable. Donation receipts matched incident reports within 48 hours. Personal payments to Fisk's account corresponded with deleted security footage logs. It was a roadmap of corruption so clear and so damning that no lawyer, no matter how expensive, could make it disappear. Brooke sat in that Starbucks for 15 minutes, organizing everything she had collected into a single coherent folder. Testimonies from 5 victims, security footage on a USB drive, 14 years of teacher documentation, financial records linking donations to cover-ups, personal payments to a principal's private account, names, dates, amounts, timestamps. Every piece interlocking with every other piece, like the gears of a machine built to deliver one thing: the truth. At 3 o'clock, Brooke made 2 phone calls. The first was to her father. Wade answered on the first ring. Dad, she said, I have everything. Witness statements, video footage, financial records, teacher testimony. It's airtight. There is not a lawyer in Ohio who can make this go away. Wade was silent for a moment. The kind of silence that carries weight. The kind of silence a father holds when his daughter has just done something that makes him understand she doesn't need protecting anymore. She needs backing up. How do you want to do this? Wade asked. I want them arrested at school, Brooke said. In front of everyone. In front of every student who's been afraid to speak up. In front of every teacher who's been told to stay quiet. I want the whole school to see that it's over. Wade's voice was steady. The brothers have been ready since dawn. 250. 6 states. Say the word. 4:30, Brooke said. The after-school activities will still have students on campus. Maximum witnesses. Maximum impact. And I want the police there too. Not after. Not in response. They're with us from the start. Done, Wade said. Anything else, bring everyone, Dad, and bring the thunder. The second call was to a number Brooke had obtained from the Toledo Police Department's public directory. Detective Claire Ashburn answered on the third ring. Detective Ashburn, Brooke said, My name is Brooke Callahan. I was the victim of an assault last night at Ridgemont High School. I know you've been assigned the case. I have evidence you need to see. Video footage of last night's attack that was ordered destroyed by Principal Warren Fisk this morning, but was preserved by a school employee. Signed statements from 5 separate victims of prior assaults by the same 5 students. Documentation from 4 teachers confirming a pattern of institutional cover-up spanning 3 years. And financial records showing over $300,000 in donations linked to the systematic burial of criminal complaints, including direct payments to the principal's personal account. There was a pause on the line. Brooke could almost hear the detective recalibrating her understanding of the case. Miss Callahan Ashburn said carefully, Where did you obtain these materials? From the people who've been waiting for someone to ask, Brooke replied. I can have copies of everything delivered to you within the hour. But I need to ask you something, Detective. Are you willing to make arrests today? Because in about 90 minutes, 250 motorcycles are going to arrive at Ridgemont High School. They're not coming to cause trouble. They're coming to make sure that for the first time in 3 years, the people at that school can't pretend nothing is happening. The arrests need to be yours. The evidence is yours. The case is yours. But the audience, that's ours. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Ashburn spoke. I'll be there at 4:30. And Miss Callahan, bring everything. Brooke ended the call. She sat alone in the Starbucks for one more moment. Through the window, the afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent toward the roof lines of Toledo, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Somewhere across the city in garages and parking lots and driveways, engines were coming to life. The deep guttural sound of Harleys and Indians and Triumphs being warmed, check prepared. In Cleveland, 23 riders swung legs over saddles. In Columbus, 18 more. Detroit sent 31, Chicago sent 44, Pennsylvania sent 27. And in Toledo itself, the brothers and sisters of the Hells Angels Charter pulled on their vests, zipped their jackets, and strapped on their helmets with the quiet deliberation of people who understood exactly what they were riding toward and exactly why it mattered. They gathered on the east side of Toledo at the clubhouse, a warehouse wrapped in chain link fencing and razor wire, the kind of place built to keep the outside world at a distance. Inside, the air was thick with oil leather and a silence that hummed with barely contained energy. 250 people stood shoulder to shoulder, men and women, young and old. Different cities, different chapters, the same patch on every back. The death head, the wings, the unmistakable symbol that meant family. Wade Callahan stood on a wooden crate so everyone could see him. He did not shout. "My daughter was attacked last night," he said. His voice carried through the warehouse like low thunder. A homeless man, a man with nothing, took a knife for her. He's in the hospital right now because he did what was right. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. But that's not why you're here. You're here because my daughter spent the last 24 hours doing what an entire school and an entire police department and an entire system couldn't do in 3 years. She found the truth. She gathered the evidence. She built the case. And now she needs us to make sure nobody looks away when it comes to light. Not a sound. 250 people breathing as one. We are not going there to threaten, Wade continued. We are not going there to fight. We are going there to stand, to be present, to make the walls shake just enough that every person in that building understands that the days of sweeping things under the rug are over. The police will be there. The arrests will happen. Our job is to make sure the whole world is watching when they do. He stepped down from the crate. Helmets went on. Engines started. The sound built from a murmur to a growl to a full-throated roar that vibrated through the walls of the warehouse and out into the streets of East Toledo. They rolled out in formation. 6 rows deep, leather vests heavy with patches, American flags fluttering from handlebars. The line stretched for blocks, a river of chrome and thunder moving through the streets of Toledo with the slow, deliberate momentum of something that could not be stopped or redirected or reasoned with. At the head of the formation rode Wade Callahan, and behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her backpack pressed against her spine, with every piece of evidence that mattered, rode Brooke Callahan, 18 years old, sleepless, battered, unbroken. The girl who refused to be silent was coming home to the school that had tried to silence everyone, and she was bringing 250 witnesses with her. At Ridgemont High School, the afternoon was winding down. After-school clubs were meeting. The volleyball team was running drills in the gymnasium. Students lingered in hallways at lockers in the parking lot. Teachers graded papers at their desks. Principal Warren Fisk sat in his office, reviewing budget projections, his coffee cold, his conscience undisturbed. Preston Ainsworth was in the weight room with Nolan Whitaker, spotting each other on the bench press, talking about nothing, laughing about nothing, existing in the comfortable numbness of boys who had never been forced to reckon with the pain they caused. At 4:27, someone in the parking lot stopped walking. Then another student stopped. Then another. They turned their heads toward the east, toward a sound that was still distant but growing. A low rumble that didn't fade, that multiplied, that built in layers and volume until it was no longer just a sound but a presence, a vibration in the air, in the ground, in the glass of every window in the building. Students drifted to the windows. Teachers stood from their desks. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The rumble grew louder, closer. It shook the panes in their frames. It rattled the trophies in the trophy case. It pressed against the walls of Ridgemont High School like the hand of something enormous testing whether the structure could hold. And then they saw it. 250 motorcycles turning onto the street in perfect formation, moving slowly, deliberately, like a funeral procession or an army approaching a fortress. 6 rows deep, chrome catching the late afternoon sun. The Hell's Angels, death head on every back. American flags rippling in the wind created by their own momentum. They fanned out and surrounded the school. Every entrance, every exit, the parking lot, the street, a solid, unbroken perimeter of leather and steel and presence. One by one, the engine stopped. The roar gave way to silence. A silence more powerful than the noise that had preceded it because it was the silence of 250 people who had chosen to be still. Inside the building, Preston Ainsworth dropped the barbell onto the rack. The metal clanged and echoed through the empty weight room. He walked to the window and looked out. The color drained from his face like water from a cracked vessel. Nolan appeared beside him, his mouth opened but no words came out. On the first floor, Warren Fisk rose from his desk and walked to his window. He looked out at the sea of motorcycles and riders that had surrounded his school, and for the first time in 20 years of managing problems and burying inconveniences, he understood that he was looking at something. His phone calls and his connections and his carefully maintained machinery of silence could not manage. And at the center of it all, climbing off the back of her father's motorcycle, her backpack in one hand and a folder in the other, stood Brooke Callahan. She pulled off the helmet Wade had given her and shook her hair free. She looked up at the building she had walked into that morning as a student and was about to walk into now as something else entirely. Behind her, 250 brothers and sisters dismounted. Boots hit the ground. The sound was synchronized, deliberate, final. Brooke took a breath. She squared her shoulders. She looked at her father. Wade met her eyes. He nodded once. A nod that said everything a father could say to a daughter he had just watched become something extraordinary. Go, I'm right behind you. Brooke Callahan walked toward the front doors of Ridgemont High School. Her footsteps were steady on the pavement. Her grip on the folder was firm. Behind her, the brotherhood followed. Before her, the truth waited. And for the first time in 3 years, silence was no longer an option. Brooke Callahan pushed through the front doors of Ridgemont High School and walked into a building that had already begun to tremble. Not from the motorcycles outside, not from the boots hitting the pavement behind her, from something older and deeper than sound, from the sudden violent collapse of a lie that had held for 3 years cracking now, under the weight of a truth that could no longer be contained. The lobby was crowded. Students had poured out of classrooms and after-school activities, drawn by the thunder of 250 engines pressed against windows, filling hallways, clustering in doorways. Their faces held a mixture of confusion and fear, and the electric anticipation that comes when something enormous is about to happen, and everyone can feel it, but no one can name it yet. Teachers stood among them, some trying to restore order, most frozen in place, watching the front entrance with the helpless expression of people who understood that the rules they had been operating under no longer applied. Brooke walked past the reception desk. The receptionist, a woman named Gloria, who had worked at Ridgemont for 11 years and had never once been paid enough to deal with a situation like this, reached for her phone with trembling fingers. Before she could dial, a woman stepped forward from the group of riders entering behind Brooke and placed her hand gently over the receiver. Jolene Briggs was 5'6", with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight braid and a leather vest that carried more patches than most men in the Brotherhood. Her voice was quiet, almost kind, but it carried the unmistakable authority of someone who was not making a request. No calls, Jolene said. Not yet. Gloria withdrew her hand. She did not reach for the phone again. Brooke kept walking. The hallway stretched before her, long and fluorescent, and lined on both sides with students who parted as she passed. Some of them knew her. Some of them recognized her from volleyball, from classes, from the ordinary fabric of high school life that now felt like it belonged to a different world. They watched her move through the corridor with her backpack on one shoulder and a thick folder in her hand, and something in her eyes that made them step aside without being asked. Behind her, Wade Callahan walked 3 paces back. Not beside her, not in front of her, behind. A deliberate choice that every rider in the Brotherhood understood. This was not his moment. This was hers. He was there to support, not to lead. To anchor, not to command. And the 249 men and women who followed him understood the same thing. They moved through the building in near silence. Leather creaked softly. Boots fell in steady rhythm on the linoleum. Not a single word was spoken. The only sound was the quiet percussion of their presence, filling every corner of the buildings like water filling a vessel, steady and absolute and impossible to push back. Principal Warren Fisk emerged from his office at the end of the administrative hallway. He had been watching from his window. He had seen the motorcycles arrive. He had seen the riders dismount. He had watched Brooke Callahan walk toward the building with the focused determination of someone coming to collect a debt, and in the 60 seconds it took her to reach the front doors, Warren Fisk had made a series of rapid calculations. None of them worked in his favor. He forced authority into his posture. He straightened his tie. He lifted his chin and set his jaw and walked toward the lobby with the deliberate stride of a man who still believed he controlled this building and everything that happened inside it. The belief was wrong, but it was the only thing he had left. "You cannot be here," Fisk said, planting himself in the center of the hallway, blocking the path forward. His voice was louder than necessary, pitched for the audience of students and teachers lining the walls. "This is private property. This is a school. I am calling the police right now." Brooke stopped 5 feet in front of him. She did not raise her voice. She did not step back. She looked up at the man who had buried 3 years of violence and corruption and human suffering beneath a veneer of administrative competence, and she spoke with a clarity that cut through the noise of the crowded hallway like a knife through paper. "The police are already on their way, Mr. Fisk. I called them myself, and you're going to want them here. Because when they arrive, I'm going to hand them evidence of every crime you've helped cover up since you took over this school. And then I'm going to stand right here and watch you explain to every student and every teacher in this building why you chose money over their safety." Fisk's mouth opened, closed. The mask of authority flickered. Beneath it, something else surfaced. Not fear exactly, not yet, but the first tremor of recognition that the ground beneath him was no longer solid. Before he could speak, Brooke turned to the hallway. Her voice carried effortlessly, filling the space with the same natural authority her father's voice carried in the clubhouse, the same unshakable certainty that made people stop and listen whether they wanted to or not. Preston Ainsworth, Nolan Whitaker, Bryce Hargrove, Colton Price, Reed Langford. She spoke each name slowly, letting it ring off the tile and glass and metal lockers. "You have 60 seconds to come to the main hallway. Every student and teacher in this building already knows what you did. The question is whether you walk down here on your own or whether every single person in this school watches you be found." Silence. The hallway held its breath. 300 students lining the walls, pressed into doorways leaning over the second-floor railing. Not a whisper, not a shuffle. The kind of silence that has weight and texture and the quality of something about to break. 10 seconds passed. 15. 20. Then a door opened on the second floor. The sound was small, a click and a creak, but in the silence it echoed like a gunshot. Preston Ainsworth stepped into the hallway. His face was flushed. His hands were trembling at his sides. The bravado that had defined him, the easy arrogance, the casual cruelty, all of it was gone, stripped away as completely as if it had never existed. What remained was a boy, just a boy. An 18-year-old standing in a hallway, realizing for the first time in his life that the walls his father had built around him were not made of stone. They were made of paper, and they were burning. Nolan Whitaker followed. Then Bryce Hargrove, emerging from a classroom doorway with the dazed expression of someone waking from a dream and discovering it had been real all along. Colton Price came next, his breathing audible, even from a floor away, short and ragged, his body betraying the panic his face was trying to conceal. Reed Langford was last. He walked out of the library with his head down and his hands in his pockets, and he did not look up as he moved toward the stairs. He descended slowly, deliberately, as though each step was taking him further from the life he had known and closer to something he could not escape. They gathered at the bottom of the staircase, 5 boys, side by side, facing the hallway, facing the students who had feared them, facing the teachers who had enabled them, facing the riders who filled the corridor behind Brooke like a wall of leather and silence and moral authority they had never encountered before. The entire school watched, every doorway, every window in the interior hallway. The second-floor railing was lined with faces. Phones were out. Cameras were recording. The machinery of silence that had protected these 5 boys for 3 years was being dismantled in real time, witnessed by hundreds of eyes and preserved on hundreds of screens. Brooke stepped forward. She did not shout. She did not need to. Last night, she said, her voice steady and clear, "These 5 boys attacked me in the parking lot behind the school. They had knives. They surrounded me. They pulled me to the ground. And the only reason I am standing here right now is because a man who sleeps behind the dumpster, outside a man who has no home and no shoes and nothing to his name, stood up and put himself between me and those knives. His name is Garrett Slade. He is 23 years old. He is in the hospital right now with 17 stitches and a blood transfusion because he did what no one in this school has been willing to do for 3 years." He stood up. She paused. Let the words settle into the silence like stones dropping into still water. But last night wasn't the first time these 5 hurt someone. She turned to the crowd. Tanner Griggs, 3 months ago, beaten in the locker room, stripped naked, left on the floor. The school buried it for a $50,000 donation. A sound moved through the crowd. Not a gasp exactly. Something lower. A collective exhale of recognition. The sound of people hearing spoken aloud what they had only ever heard whispered. 2 girls accused Bryce Hargrove of assault. Both cases were buried. Both families were paid off. Both girls left this school. The sound grew. Students looked at each other, looked at the teachers, looked at the 5 boys standing at the base of the staircase with nowhere to hide. Preston put a sophomore in the hospital with a broken jaw 6 months ago. No charges, no consequences. His father's law firm made it disappear overnight. Brooke lifted the folder in her hand. She held it high enough for the entire hallway to see. This folder contained signed statements from 5 victims. Security footage that Principal Fisk ordered, destroyed this morning, but that was preserved by a staff member who decided that the truth mattered more than his job. 14 years of documented complaints from teachers in this building who tried to report abuse and were threatened into silence. And financial records showing $347,000 in donations timed to specific incidents, along with $42,000 in direct payments to Principal Fisk's personal bank account. She lowered the folder and looked directly at Fisk. The principal stood frozen at the edge of the hallway, his face the color of old concrete, his hands gripping the edge of a trophy case as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Every student in this building deserves to know the truth," Brooke said. "And the truth is that this school sold their safety. It sold their trust. It sold the belief that someone would protect them. And it did it for money." She let the silence hold for 1 beat. 2, 3. That ends today. The front doors of the building opened. The late afternoon light poured in, framing the silhouettes of 6 Toledo police officers entering in formation. At the front was Detective Claire Ashburn. She was 44 years old, compact and precise, with short brown hair and the focused intensity of a woman who had built her career on doing thorough work in a system that often rewarded shortcuts. She had been assigned to the Garrett Slade case that morning. She had expected a straightforward assault investigation. What she had received, delivered to her office by courier 2 hours earlier, was the most comprehensive package of evidence she had encountered in 16 years on the force. Ashburn walked through the lobby and stopped beside Brooke. Their eyes met briefly. A look passed between them that required no words. Respect, acknowledgement, a shared understanding that what was happening in this hallway was the product of a girl who had done in 24 hours was what an entire institution had failed to do in 3 years. Brooke handed her the folder. The USB drive was already inside, sealed in a labeled envelope. "Everything is here," Brooke said quietly, stepping to the side. "It's your case now, Detective." Ashburn took the folder. She opened it. Her jaw tightened as she turned the first pages. Financial statements, time-stamped footage logs, teacher testimonies, student statements. A web of corruption laid out with a precision that would make a prosecutor's job embarrassingly easy. She looked up. She nodded once to her officers. Then she stepped toward the 5 boys. That was when everything almost fell apart. The front doors opened again. Douglas Ainsworth strode into the building like a man who owned it, and in many ways he had. He was tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a navy suit with a burgundy tie. His shoes were Italian leather. His watch cost more than most teachers at Ridgemont made in a month. He carried himself with the coiled confidence of someone who had spent 30 years bending systems to his will and had never once failed. Behind him walked a younger attorney carrying a leather attaché case. The junior lawyer moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who was paid very well to handle the mechanics of making problems disappear. Detective Douglas said, his voice filling the hallway with the measured, authoritative tone of a man accustomed to controlling rooms. I represent Preston Ainsworth, and I have in my hand a temporary restraining order issued by Judge Harold Parkman 30 minutes ago, prohibiting the arrest or detention of my client, pending a hearing on the admissibility of evidence collected under duress and potential intimidation by a criminal organization. He held up a sheet of paper, crisp and official, bearing a judge's signature. His expression was calm, practiced, certain. He had done this before. He had always won before. The paper was his sword and his shield, and he wielded it with the confidence of a man who believed that the law was a tool that belonged to whoever could afford to use it best. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Students shifted uneasily. Teachers exchanged glances. The 5 boys at the base of the staircase straightened slightly, a flicker of hope crossing their faces for the first time since the motorcycles arrived. Maybe this would end the way it always ended. Maybe the paper would save them. Maybe the money would work one more time. Brooke felt it. The shift in the air. The fraction of doubt that crept into the hallway like cold water seeping under a door. She had seen this before. Not personally, but through her father. Through years of watching how power operated from the edges. She knew what Douglas Ainsworth was doing. He was not just presenting a legal document. He was performing. He was reminding everyone in the building that he was the most powerful person in the room, that the system answered to men like him, and that the rules could always be rewritten by those who could afford to pay the author. Ashburn studied the restraining order. Her expression was neutral, professional, unreadable. She handed it to one of her officers for verification. The hallway held its breath. 300 students, 250 riders, 6 police officers, 1 girl holding a folder, and 1 attorney holding a piece of paper. The moment balanced on a razor's edge. Then a voice came from the crowd. He witnessed all of them. Every head turned. Mrs. Lorraine Beckett stepped out of a classroom doorway. She was trembling. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers interlocked, knuckles white. Tears were streaming down her face. But her voice, though it shook, did not stop. "I tried to report them," she said. The words came faster now, pushed forward by 14 years of pressure that had finally found its release. "3 times I filed reports documenting harassment, intimidation, and physical violence by those 5 students. 3 times Principal Fisk called me into his office and told me to drop it. He said their families were too important. He said my career would be finished if I kept pushing. He said complications would arise with my pension review." She took a shaking breath and looked directly at Fisk, who stood motionless against the trophy case, his face hollow. "I kept copies of everything," Lorraine continued. "Every report, every email, every directive to stand down. 14 years of documentation that proves this school systematically buried criminal behavior to protect its funding." Before the echo of her words had faded, another figure stepped forward. Coach Chet Maddox. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders and chest, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades on football fields in Ohio weather. His voice was gravel and quiet and carried the weight of a confession long overdue. "He told me the same thing," Chet said. "After Nolan Whitaker pushed a freshman down the stairs in the East Wing, I filed a formal incident report. Fisk buried it within 48 hours. When I asked what happened to it, he told me to focus on football and leave the administrative decisions to the administration." Another teacher emerged from a doorway. Patricia Wellman, Science Department, 22 years at Ridgemont Bifocals, pushed up on her forehead, her gradebook still clutched in one hand, as though she had walked out of her classroom mid-thought and followed the truth into the hallway without stopping to put it down. "I have documentation of 7 incidents," Patricia said. 7. 3 involving Preston Ainsworth, 2 involving Bryce Hargrove. All of them reported to Fisk. All of them buried. Then Frank O'Brien from the guidance office, a soft-spoken man who had spent 15 years listening to students describe fear and pain and hopelessness, stepped forward and said simply, "I kept records too. Every student who came to me, every case I referred upward that was sent back down with instructions to close the file. I have all of it." Then a 5th teacher, Margaret Sizemore, who taught sophomore history and had never spoken to any of the other four about what she had seen and documented. She stood in the hallway with her arms crossed and her chin lifted and said, "I watched those boys torment a student with a learning disability for an entire semester. I reported it 4 times. Fisk told me the student was exaggerating. The student transferred 2 months later. His mother told me he cried every morning before school. 5 teachers, 5 separate voices, 5 independent records kept in secret for years by people who had been threatened and silenced and pushed into corners and told that their careers and their pensions and their futures depended on looking the other way. And now, standing in a hallway surrounded by 300 students and 250 riders and 6 police officers, they were done looking away." Ashburn turned to Douglas Ainsworth. The restraining order was still in her officer's hand, but it no longer carried the gravitational weight it had moments ago. Something had shifted. The foundation of the legal argument that the evidence had been collected under duress by a criminal organization had just been demolished by 5 school teachers who had walked into the hallway of their own volition and spoken of their own accord. "Mr. Ainsworth," Ashburn said, her voice level and precise, "the evidence I have in this folder was collected by your son's victim, a private citizen exercising her right to gather information relevant to a criminal investigation. The security footage was preserved by a school employee acting on his own conscience. The financial documents were provided voluntarily by a cooperating witness. And the testimony of these 5 educators was given freely in public in front of several hundred witnesses. None of it was obtained under duress, none of it was coerced, and none of it falls within the scope of your restraining order." She paused and let the silence work. "Furthermore, the evidence presented includes documentation of direct financial payments to Principal Warren Fisk's personal accounts that correlate with the suppression of criminal complaints. That alone constitutes probable cause for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to conceal criminal activity, and failure to report suspected child abuse. Your restraining order addresses the arrest of your client. It does not prevent me from arresting the principal of this school. And once that arrest is made and the evidence is entered into the record, I expect the scope of this investigation will expand considerably." Douglas Ainsworth's expression did not change. His posture remained straight. His grip on the restraining order remained firm. But something behind his eyes shifted, a recalculation. The recognition that the game had changed in a way he had not anticipated and could not undo with a single phone call to a friendly judge. Brooke stepped forward. She stood directly in front of Douglas Ainsworth. This man who had spent 30 years buying silence and manufacturing innocence for people who deserved neither. She was 18 years old. She had not slept in 36 hours. Her body ached and her eyes burned, and her hands were steady. "Your money bought silence," Brooke said. Her voice was quiet enough that Douglas had to lean slightly forward to hear her, and that involuntary movement, that small concession of space, was itself a defeat. "But it didn't buy mine, and it won't buy theirs." She gestured to the teachers, to the students, to the riders who filled the hallway in silent witness. Douglas looked at the faces surrounding him, hundreds of them, recording, watching, refusing to look away. And he understood, perhaps for the first time in his career, that he was standing in a room where his currency had no value. He lowered the restraining order. He turned to his junior attorney. "Let's go," he said. His voice was flat, stripped of its performance. They walked out of the building. No one stopped them. No one needed to. The battle had already been lost. Ashburn moved quickly after that. She approached Preston Ainsworth first, the boy who had stood at the top of a hierarchy built on fear and money and institutional cowardice. His face was white. His hands hung limp at his sides. The knife he had carried the night before was gone, replaced by the hollow understanding that nothing and no one was coming to save him. "Preston Ainsworth," Ashburn said, "you are under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping, and conspiracy." She guided his hands behind his back. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that was small and metallic and final. She read him his rights in a clear, measured voice that every person in the hallway could hear. Preston did not resist. He did not speak. He stared straight ahead as Ashburn turned him toward the front doors and began walking him through the corridor. Past the students who had feared him, past the teachers who had protected him, past the lockers and the trophy case, and the bulletin board and advertising the winter formal he would never attend. His footsteps echoed on the linoleum with the hollow sound of a life being emptied of everything it had taken for granted. Nolan Whitaker was next. The moment the officer stepped toward him, Nolan collapsed. Not dramatically, not with a shout. His knees simply gave out and he crumpled to the floor sobbing. The sound was raw and ugly and entirely without dignity. Tears and snot streamed down his face as he gasped for air, between sobs repeating the same phrase over and over. It wasn't supposed to go this far. It wasn't supposed to go this far. As though the violence had been a game. As though the knives had been props. As though the blood on the parking lot asphalt had been something temporary that could be washed away with the right amount of regret. An officer helped him to his feet. The handcuffs closed around his wrists. He was led away still crying, his body shaking the facade of toughness that had defined him for 3 years, dissolving like sugar in rain. Bryce Hargrove shouted, his voice cracked as it rose, breaking between rage and terror. "My father's lawyers will destroy every one of you. This is illegal. This is entrapment. You can't do this." The words were loud and fast and directed at no one and everyone, a last desperate broadcast into a room that had already stopped listening. An officer read him his rights while Bryce continued to protest, his voice growing hoarse, his arguments growing weaker, until the sound of his own handcuffs clicking shut silenced him completely. Colton Price hyperventilated. His breathing came in short, rapid gasps that sounded like a motor struggling to turn over. His face was gray. Sweat beaded on his forehead and upper lip. A school nurse stepped forward and was gently waved back by an officer who secured Colton's hands and guided him toward the door with the careful efficiency of someone trained to handle people in the middle of physical panic. Colton's legs were unsteady. He stumbled twice. The boy who had pulled a second knife in a parking lot 12 hours earlier could not walk a straight line without help. Reed Langford was last. He stood apart from the others, his head bowed, his hands already extended in front of him when the officer approached. He did not speak. He did not cry. He did not protest. He simply held out his wrists and let the handcuffs close around them with the quiet acceptance of someone who had known this moment was coming long before it arrived. As he was led past the crowd, he lifted his head once and looked at the sea of faces watching him. His eyes found no one in particular. They swept across the hallway with an expression that was difficult to read. Shame, perhaps, or exhaustion, or the terrible clarity that comes when a person finally sees the full shape of the damage they have participated in and understands that understanding has come too late. 5 boys, 5 sets of handcuffs, 5 walks through a hallway lined with the people they had terrorized and the system that had enabled them. Phones recorded every second. The footage would be online within hours, shared and replayed and dissected by thousands and then millions. For once, the story would not be buried. For once, the machinery of silence had been dismantled publicly, irreversibly, in front of witnesses who would never forget what they saw. But Brooke was not finished. She turned to Detective Ashburn and nodded toward the administrative wing. Ashburn understood. They walked together down the hallway, past the main office, past the conference room, past the framed photographs of smiling students that lined the walls like advertisements for a version of Ridgemont High School that had never truly existed. Brooke led, Ashburn walked beside her, Wade followed at a distance, his presence steady and silent. They entered Warren Fisk's office without knocking. The principal was standing behind his desk. He had not moved since the arrest began. His face was the color of ash. His hands gripped the edge of the desk so tightly that the tendons stood out beneath the skin like cables. His wire-rimmed glasses sat slightly crooked on his nose, and he had not corrected them, a small detail that betrayed the magnitude of his unraveling. Brooke placed the folder on his desk. She opened it to the financial documents Vivian Langford had provided. Receipts, bank statements, wire transfers, dates that matched incident reports with surgical precision. $347,000 in donations, Brooke said, all timed within 48 hours of specific incidents being reported and buried, plus $42,000 in direct deposits to a personal account in your name. She looked at him. You didn't just ignore what was happening, Mr. Fisk. You profited from it. You turned this school into a marketplace where student safety was sold to the highest bidder. And you threatened every teacher who tried to stop you. Fisk stared at the documents. His mouth moved slightly as though rehearsing words that would not form. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was barely a whisper. "This is insane," he said. "You're a student. You can't come in here and accuse me of—" "I'm not accusing you," Brooks said. "The documents are accusing you. The footage is accusing you. 5 of your own teachers are accusing you. I'm just the one who put it all together." Detective Ashburn stepped forward. She produced a pair of handcuffs from her belt with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had done this 1,000 times. "Warren Fisk," she said, "you are being detained for questioning regarding obstruction of justice, conspiracy to conceal criminal activity, and failure to report suspected child abuse as mandated by Ohio state law." Fisk's hands released the desk. His arms dropped to his sides. His shoulders collapsed inward. The transformation was complete. The man who had controlled this school, who had silenced victims and protected predators and traded safety for donations, was now a diminished figure standing in his own office, watching everything he had built crumble around him like a house made of cards in a windstorm. He was led out of his office, past the desk where he had buried 17 complaints, past the filing cabinet where he had stored the evidence of his corruption, past the framed diploma on the wall, and the motivational poster that read, "Building Tomorrow's Leaders Today." Past the 5 teachers standing in the hallway who watched him walk by with expressions that held no satisfaction, only relief. Only the exhausted, trembling relief of people who had been carrying a secret for years and had finally been allowed to set it down. No one clapped. No one cheered. The Hells Angels stood in silence as Fisk was escorted through the building and out the front doors into a parking lot filled with police cruisers and chrome and the fading light of an October afternoon. Justice did not raise its voice. It did not need to. It simply did the work. In a classroom doorway near the east stairwell, Tanner Griggs stood quietly. He had watched everything. The arrests, the confessions, the teachers stepping forward, the principal being led away. He had watched the 5 boys who had beaten him and stripped him and left him shaking on a cold tile floor, walk past him in handcuffs, powerless for the first time. Tears streamed down his face. They were not tears of fear, not this time. They were the tears of a boy who had spent 3 months believing that what happened to him would never matter, that no one would ever believe him, that the system would always protect the people who hurt him. And now, standing in a hallway filled with evidence and witnesses and the undeniable presence of people who refused to look away, he understood that he had been wrong. Brooke found him there. She walked over and stood beside him. She did not touch him. She did not try to fill the moment with words. She simply stood next to him and let the silence be enough. Tanner looked at her, his chin trembled. He nodded once. Brooke nodded back. A small exchange. A quiet acknowledgement between 2 people who understood what it cost to break silence and what it meant to be believed. The fallout was immediate and total. Within days, the story dominated every local outlet before spreading far beyond Toledo. Preston Ainsworth, Nolan Whitaker, Bryce Hargrove, Colton Price, and Reed Langford were each charged as adults. Assault with a deadly weapon, attempted kidnapping, hate crime enhancements for targeting a homeless individual. The charges were severe, and for the first time in their lives, no amount of money softened the landing. Sentencing came swiftly. Preston Ainsworth received 8 years. Nolan Whitaker received 7. Bryce Hargrove received 9, compounded by prior buried allegations that were now admissible. Colton Price received 6. Reed Langford received 7. All 5 were sent to separate facilities. No shared protection, no familiar faces. No fathers in the hallway making phone calls that carried weight. For the first time, they were alone with the consequences of their actions. Warren Fisk was fired immediately. The district severed ties before the charges were formally filed. He was later charged with obstruction of justice, conspiracy to conceal criminal activity, and failure to report child abuse. Facing overwhelming evidence, including the testimony of 5 teachers and the financial records that Vivian Langford had provided, he pleaded guilty to avoid trial. His teaching license was permanently revoked. He served 18 months in a state facility, leaving behind the office where he had quietly traded the safety of children for checks with too many zeros. Ridgemont High School closed for an entire semester. A state investigation dissolved the school board, uncovering $1.2 million in misappropriated funds. The corruption stretched back 7 years, woven into budgets and contracts and conveniently ignored complaints, like rot hidden behind fresh paint. When the school reopened, it did so under entirely new leadership, with mandatory reporting policies, independent oversight, and a zero-tolerance approach to abuse that could no longer be negotiated away with a phone call or a donation. Tanner Griggs, the name that Tanner Griggs had been in the original reports, received a formal apology from the district. Not a quiet letter slipped into a mailbox. A public acknowledgement, spoken aloud, recorded, entered into the official record. He also received a settlement, though no amount of money could undo the mornings he had spent crying before school or the nights he had spent staring at his ceiling, wondering why no one had helped him. But this time his story was believed, and that for Tanner Griggs was worth more than any check. Harlan Mosley retired 3 months early. His pension was unaffected. The school district, eager to avoid further scandal, processed his paperwork without delay. On his last day, he left his small office, surrounded by server racks and cable bundles, and 19 years of accumulated quiet, and he drove home with the USB drive slot in his desk drawer, finally empty and his conscience finally clear. Mrs. Lorraine Beckett continued teaching. She returned to room 214 the first day Ridgemont reopened and stood before a new class of students with the same bifocals sliding down her nose and the same voice that could make Shakespeare feel like a conversation. But something was different. The weight she had been carrying was gone. She stood straighter. She spoke louder. And on the wall behind her desk, she hung a small framed quote she had handwritten on an index card. It read, "Silence is a choice. So is courage." 3 days after the arrest, Garrett Slade woke up to something he had not seen in years: color. His hospital room was filled with flowers crowding the windowsill, lining the counters, spilling from containers that ranged from glass vases to repurposed coffee cans. Cards were stacked beside his bed, some handwritten by students at Ridgemont, some from strangers who had seen the news coverage and felt compelled to send a message to the man who had stepped out from behind a dumpster with nothing and given everything. Everything. Wade Callahan sat in the chair beside the bed, but this time he was not alone. 8 members of the Brotherhood stood around the room, filling the space with a presence that felt steady and protective, not intimidating, anchoring. "How are you feeling?" Wade asked. Garrett shifted, trying to sit up. Pain shot through his side and his arm. He winced, the stitches pulling tight against swollen flesh. "Like I got stabbed," he said hoarsely, "multiple times." Wade exhaled a short breath that might have been a laugh. "Yeah," he said, "about that." He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He smoothed it carefully before placing it on Garrett's lap. "That's a lease," Wade said. "1-bedroom apartment on Miller Street. First year's rent paid, furniture included." Garrett stared at the paper. He didn't reach for it, didn't unfold it. His brow furrowed, confusion and disbelief wrestling across his features like weather systems colliding. "I can't," he said quietly. "I don't have money." Wade shook his head. "You don't need money," he said. "You have brothers now." Something broke, not loudly, not dramatically, the way a dam breaks when the pressure has been building for so long that the structure simply cannot hold any longer. Garrett's eyes filled with tears, fast, uncontained. His chest hitched as he struggled to breathe around the weight of what was happening. His cracked, calloused hands, the hands of a mechanic, the hands of a man who had once built things and fixed things and made things work, trembled on the hospital blanket. "I'm not," he started, and his voice cracked apart like dry wood. "I'm nobody." Wade leaned forward. His voice was firm but gentle, carrying the weight of a man who understood exactly what it meant to be dismissed by the world and rebuilt by the people who chose to see you. "You're the man who saved my daughter," Wade said. "You had nothing and you gave everything. That makes you somebody. That makes you family." A woman stepped forward from the back of the room, Denise Paxton, Gears, the same woman who had stood in the doorway of this hospital room and sent a lawyer running with nothing but her voice and her presence. "We also got you a job," Denise said. "Auto shop on 5th Street. Owner's a friend of ours. You start when you're healed up." She paused and a half smile crossed her face. "I hear you're good with engines." Garrett tried to speak. No words came. He just nodded, over and over, the way a man nods when language has failed him, and the only response left is the most basic human gesture of acknowledgement. "Yes, I hear you. I understand. This is real." Wade stood and placed a heavy hand on Garrett's shoulder. The weight of it was enormous and grounding. The hand of a man who had broken things and built things and protected things his entire life, resting on the shoulder of a man who had done the bravest thing he would ever witness. "You're not invisible anymore," Brother Wade said. "You never will be again." Days later, Garrett noticed something on the small table beside his hospital bed. A familiar patch, the worn Harley-Davidson logo from Brooks' backpack. It had been cleaned and pressed and placed in a simple wooden frame. The stitching was still frayed at the edges. The colors were still faded from years of use, but it was preserved now, protected. A small piece of thread and fabric that marked the exact moment when two worlds collided in a dark parking lot, and everything that followed became inevitable. 2 weeks later, Garrett Slade walked into his apartment on Miller Street. He stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside. There was a bed with clean sheets, a couch with cushions that didn't smell like damp cardboard, a kitchen table with 2 chairs. Clean clothes hung neatly in the closet selected by Denise, who had guessed his size with the practiced eye of a woman who had been outfitting riders for decades. The refrigerator hummed softly, stocked with food. Real food. Bread and eggs and milk and things that came in packages meant for kitchens, not dumpsters. The silence in the apartment was different from any silence Garrett had known. It was not the silence of being ignored. It was not the silence of lying behind a dumpster listening to the world walk past. It was the silence of peace, of safety, of a door he could close and lock and know that the space on the other side belonged to him. On the kitchen counter sat a handwritten note on a piece of cardboard that had been cut and folded with care. The handwriting was large and slightly uneven, the penmanship of someone more comfortable with a wrench than a pen. It read, "Welcome home, the Brotherhood." Garrett Slade sat down on his couch. His couch, in his apartment, with his clothes in his closet and his food in his refrigerator and his name on a lease that someone had paid for because they believed he was worth it. And he cried, long and deep and without any attempt to stop. For the first time in 5 years, the tears were not from hunger, not from cold, not from the grinding, relentless pain of being forgotten. They were from finally belonging, from being seen, from the overwhelming, unbearable kindness of strangers who had decided he was not a stranger anymore. Every Sunday after that, Brooke Callahan drove to the apartment on Miller Street. She brought coffee from a shop on the corner that Garrett had come to prefer. 2 cups, black for him, cream and sugar for her. They sat on his couch or at his kitchen table or, when the weather was mild, on the small concrete stoop outside his front door, and they talked about small things. The weather, work, a car that came into the shop with a transmission problem so unusual that Garrett's eyes lit up when he described it the way a musician's eyes light up when they hear a chord progression that surprises them. Brooke told him about college applications, about a scholarship she was pursuing, about a future she was building, with the same methodical determination she had used to build a case against 5 boys and a principal in 24 hours. They did not talk about that night very often. They didn't need to. Some bonds are not built on conversation. They are built on moments that change the shape of a life. And once that shape is changed, the bond exists whether you speak of it or not. Garrett had stepped between a knife and a stranger. Brooke had taken 24 hours and turned them into a weapon that dismantled a 3-year empire of silence. They had saved each other in different ways at different times, and the debt between them was not a debt at all. It was a bridge, and it held. Garrett Slade still works at the auto shop on 5th Street. He shows up early every morning. He is good with engines. He has grease under his fingernails and stability under his feet. He has an apartment and a key and a door that locks and a refrigerator that hums and a couch where he sits on Sunday mornings waiting for the sound of Brooke's car pulling up to the curb. He has friends who wear leather and ride motorcycles and call him brother without irony. He has a place at a table. He has a name that people know. On the wall above his workbench at the shop, mounted in a simple wooden frame, hangs a faded Harley-Davidson patch with frayed stitching and colors dulled by years of being carried on a backpack by a girl who refused to be silent. Garrett looks at it every morning when he arrives. He doesn't stare. He doesn't linger. He just glances at it the way a man glances at a compass. A quick confirmation that he knows where he is, that he knows how he got here, that the direction is still true. And if there is something this story leaves behind, something that echoes after the motorcycles have gone and the courtroom doors have closed and the headlines have faded, it is this: silence is a choice, and so is standing up. One lets harm grow in the dark. The other drags it into the light and holds it there until the world cannot pretend it doesn't see. For 3 years, teachers saw abuse and said nothing. Administrators chose money over morality. Wealthy families bought their sons distance from consequences. And for those same 3 years, victims suffered quietly. They learned the rules fast. Speaking up made things worse. Reporting led nowhere. Silence at least kept the targets smaller. The system didn't just fail them. It trained them not to trust it. Garrett Slade was homeless. He was powerless. He was invisible. He had no influence, no money, no social standing, no expectation that anyone would come if he called for help. And yet, when it mattered most, he was the only one who refused to be silent. Brooke Callahan was 18 years old. She had been attacked, terrified, nearly killed. Every instinct told her to retreat, to let others handle it, to trust the system that was supposed to protect people like her. Instead, she spent 24 sleepless hours dismantling that system piece by piece, not with violence, not with threats, but with evidence and courage, and the stubborn refusal to let anyone tell her that the truth was someone else's responsibility. The most powerless person in that parking lot was the only one with the courage to act, and the girl he saved turned that courage into something the whole world could see. Think about that. A homeless man and an 18-year-old girl did what an entire institution, staffed with educated adults and funded with hundreds of thousands of dollars, could not do in 3 years. Not because they had resources, because they had something that cannot be purchased or administered or written into a policy manual. They had the willingness to stand up. And standing up changed everything. So here is the question this story leaves you with. Not a dramatic question. Not a rhetorical flourish designed to make you feel something for a moment before you scroll to the next video. A real question, an honest one. The kind of question that sits quietly in the back of your mind and waits for the moment when it matters. What will you do the next time you see something wrong? Because that moment will come. It always does. It might be small at first. An insult dismissed as a joke, a kid sitting alone because everyone else decided he wasn't worth the effort. A rumor that everyone pretends not to hear. Or it might be bigger, louder, harder to ignore. A lie that everyone accepts because challenging it is inconvenient. A wrong that everyone sees but no one addresses because addressing it carries risk. The choice will be the same one it has always been. The same one Garrett faced in the dark behind a dumpster. The same one Brooke faced in a hospital room when she told her father to wait. The same one Lorraine Beckett faced when she stepped into the hallway and said the words she had been holding for 14 years. Will you be the one who looks away? Or will you be the one who stands up because silence protects predators? It always has. In breaking it, no matter who you are, no matter how powerless you feel, no matter how much you think your voice doesn't matter, that is where change begins. Not in courtrooms, not in boardrooms, not in institutions built to manage problems rather than solve them. Change begins with a single person who decides that being quiet is no longer something they can live with. Garrett Slade decided that on a cold October night behind a dumpster in Toledo, Ohio. Brooke Callahan decided it in a hospital room 18 hours later. And together with the help of teachers who found their courage, and riders who answered a call, and a detective who did her job, and a woman who chose her conscience over her marriage, they tore down a wall that money and silence had built over 3 years and held in place with fear. That wall is gone now. The boys are in prison. The principal is disgraced. The school has been rebuilt, and a man who was invisible sits in an auto shop on 5th Street with grease on his hands and sunlight coming through an open bay door, and he is seen. Not because he asked for attention, not because he demanded recognition, because he earned something far more lasting than either. Respect. Somewhere right now, Brooke Callahan is filling out a college application at a kitchen table in Toledo. She pauses every now and then and looks at her phone where a text from Garrett sits unread. Something about a transmission he figured out, and a joke about a customer that probably isn't as funny as he thinks it is. She smiles. She goes back to the application. Under the section that asks about challenges she has overcome, she writes a single sentence. I refuse to be silent, and I found out I wasn't alone. This is what justice looks like when systems fail and humans step forward. This is what happens when ordinary people, a homeless man with no shoes, an 18-year-old girl with a backpack, a group of riders who answered a call, decide that silence is no longer something they are willing to carry. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for refusing to look away. I'll see you in the next story.